Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Appraisal Buzzcast. We have a great episode for you today, and we appreciate all the comments we've been getting recently. Hal is a little under the weather, but he has COVID, but he is joining us today anyways. He's fighting through it. Hal, it finally got you after 3 years.
3 years and 1 month without any contact with COVID. And Monday morning during the team meeting, one of the team members said they had COVID. I took a test and popped positive immediately. But as you can see, I'm out here in the middle of the woods in our little cabin and totally sequestered, taking care of myself. So yeah, I think we're going to be fine.
All right. Well, I'm glad to hear that. We have a really exciting guest today. We have Stacy Caprioli from Nationwide Appraisal Network. Let me pull up Stacy. Stacy, how are you?
I'm good. How are you both?
Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you joining us. This is your first time on the Buzzcast, so we appreciate you taking the time.
I'm excited to be here, and Hal, you're a trooper for pushing through COVID to keep filming.
Well, I think I got through the worst of it over the weekend. I'm feeling pretty good today. I got a good night's sleep last night, so I think we're good to go. Stacy, thank you for being here. Where are you located, Stacy?
I'm up in Wisconsin, so we are just getting our first peak of spring today, where it's over 50 degrees in the morning, which is an amazing feeling. It's like the light at the end of winter tunnel.
I love it. I'm sitting here looking out the window, and there's 3 dogwood trees in full bloom and a bunch of redbud trees going down the hill. I've got a fire going in the wood burning stove out on the deck. So life is not bad here. Stacy, tell me, what is Nationwide Appraisal Network?
So Nationwide Appraisal Network is a national AMC. We have 14,000 plus appraisers on our panel, and we have, it's a large reaching panel. We are in every state of the country. So we are, representing many larger lenders that order their appraisals through us, and we are, facilitating those appraisals through our panel. So it's definitely a lot of work with a lot of really important people that back us.
And you are the chief appraiser there at NAN. Tell me a little bit about your background. How long have you been an appraiser? How did you end up being chief appraiser?
I am the chief appraiser here at NAN. I've been with NAN since last June, so just a little bit of a short stint, but a great stint at that. Before that, I worked for a company out of Buffalo called Mueller Reports, doing the hybrid and bifurcated. And I've also worked for companies like US Bank, CoreLogic. I've been an appraiser since, I think 2012 was when I finally got my certification. Prior to that, I worked for a company called American Appraisal Associates, which I'm kind of dating myself. It's been sold over a couple of times, but I did nationwide inspections of properties. You name it, I've probably inspected it. And that really sparked my love for the valuation industry.
I love it. Yeah, I became certified general in 1992. And much like you, I have been all over the country and looked at all manner of real estate, from single family residences to I'm thinking of a single wide trailer on a river, to a huge mixed use, adaptive reuse, historic property in downtown St. Louis. So this work of being an appraiser is, I know a lot of people are out there hurting with business, a little bit of slowdown. But I have been in this business long enough to see it go up and to see it go back down and see it go back up and see it go back down. But it's always fun. I've always enjoyed going out and looking at the properties and seeing what weird things people do with their houses. Well, that's awesome. I'm really glad you're here today, Stacy. I'm going to take a real quick break and give a shout out to one of our sponsors, and then we'll come back and continue the conversation.
Since 1978, LIA Administrators and Insurance Services has been offering E&O insurance to valuation professionals. LIA applies superior customer service, exceptional liability education from Peter Christensen, and unparalleled claim defense managed by Claudia Gaglioni. LIA offers errors and omissions, commercial bonds, general liability, cyber liability, and real estate agents and brokers E&O. Visit liability.com or call 800 334 0652.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Hal Humphreys. You're listening to the Appraisal Buzz. I'm joined with Stacy Caprioli here from National Appraisal Network. Stacy, let's talk about contributory value. What does that even mean?
Right. Yeah. And I had done we do these Ask Nan minutes on our social media, and this was one of my most recent topics because it comes up quite a bit when I'm discussing with our appraisers, with brokers and lenders that are coming forward and asking about certain features. And to us as appraisers, contributory factor is really about how one element of that property can contribute to the larger value. And I think there's sometimes, it can contribute negatively and it can contribute positively, but it's really about looking at different features and making sure that you're understanding how that's going to contribute value in your overall appraisal.
Okay, so we're talking about contributory value specific features. So what comes to my mind is I do a lot of rural appraisal. Most of my work is from Nashville, Tennessee, to the west, to the Tennessee River. So I'm in some pretty hayseed counties out here in the middle of nowhere. And a lot of times I'll have, let's say, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1950s vintage brick ranch in, good, solid C3 condition. It's been well maintained. But in the back, maybe it's on 20 acres.
Right.
But in the back, there's this 70 by 50, 30-foot clear height shop that has, 2 auto lifts and a bridge crane. And it's like, what is this thing worth?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example of something where, it really is the owner of the property's preference to build specific things that work for them as they live there. So, not everyone is going to want, vehicle lifts, for example, in that regard. So, it's about finding a comparison.
Stacy, I think we can agree everybody wants vehicle lifts.
Well, I don't personally need a vehicle lift, but you're right. Somebody is going to want a vehicle lift. But it's really about finding comparison for those items and that's the challenge of really being an appraiser, is going out and saying, okay, well, you built this great structure that you preferred to build, and it has all of these contributory items for that property, but we need to find something that compares to be able to extract an adjustment. And that's where we talk about contributory value, is how do we establish that value without having something that's similar in the market?
And along those lines, what would you like to see as a chief appraiser if you've got a report coming through that has this 70 by 50 foot, 30 foot clear height shop in the backyard? What would you like to see for support for contributory value for something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always come from the place, and I tell this to all of the appraisers that I talk to on our panel, is that commentary is often the support for anything that we're doing in our report. So first and foremost, commentary about when that structure was built, what the purpose of that structure is, supporting whether it's permitted, making sure that the appraiser is expanding their time frame and their distances to find something that's similar in nature. Maybe they'll find a similar shop, but it won't have the lift for the vehicles. But you can still use that as a way to extract your adjustment. So that's my goal with our appraisers, to say, push your distances, push your time frame, but support it with commentary, because without that commentary, the next reader and the next reader and the next reader is going to say, whoa, hey, where did this come from? And how do you support it? So that's really what I'm looking for, is anything you do, make sure you have the comparables there, the commentary there, and you're able to, repeat it.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. So I'm looking at that property. It's plus or minus 20 acres. I've got a sale that's 50 miles away, but it's pretty darn close as far as characteristics. Is that too far away?
I would say no. I think that it really depends on the market. I mean, especially in a rural market, if you can support that comparable has a similar market appeal to the property that you're looking at, then distance doesn't really necessarily matter. But again, supporting that by indicating, neighborhood boundaries of both properties, indicating the site sizes and how they contribute to value, indicating, what would appeal to a buyer 50 miles from there and what would appeal to a buyer on your property. Those are the things that we need as support. So, mileage is just a gauge as long as you can support how they are truly comparable being that far apart.
And how about this? I'm going to do the same scenario, but we've got a sale 4 miles away, but it happened 3 years ago. If I, as an appraiser, have that sale and derive a percentage adjustment, and let's say everything else is the same, it's another 20-acre lot, same size house, basically the same shop, and I've got a matched pair over here that doesn't have the shop, and I can extract an adjustment there. It's 3 years old, but if I do a percentage adjustment and then explain what I've done, would that work for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is, the market becomes one of almost our most challenging adjustments to derive. So if someone can really truly do their research and their due diligence on the market and extract a percentage for that adjustment, then, a near model match is always going to be your best comparable, even if it is distant or dated. So again, just supporting that you have researched the changes in the market. 3 years is a long time. A lot can happen in that time, but as long as you have that research and that commentary behind it, it definitely can be a supported comp.
There was a time, and you may not be old enough to remember this, but there was a time in the appraisal business when there was a magazine called The Communicator. Do you remember that magazine?
I have heard of it. Yeah. I have.
Here's the thing. I think it was such a brilliant name because appraisers, at the end of the day, the only way we can make our case for a thing is to communicate what we did, how we did it, and why we did it.
Right. Absolutely. And when I first started out in this industry, someone that I worked for very closely used to say, repeatable and defendable over and over and over again. And it just became ingrained in my mind that, in order to repeat and defend what you're doing, you have to be able to communicate that to the reader. You have to be able to understand that not just the underwriter at the first company has to know what you're doing, but at Fannie, at Freddie, at the lenders that as they get resold, everyone has to understand that. So making sure that communication, that's a great way to say it, communicating your results is the best way to make sure you're supportive.
And now, one final question before we move off this topic. I'm appraising that same property. I've got a 50-mile away sale that's relatively current. I've got one that's 4 miles away that's 3 years old. That's 2 data points. I'm not personally really comfortable with that, but it's like, that's all there is. I can't just make things up. How would you feel if I, as an appraiser, did a depreciated cost analysis on that structure to further support that adjustment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that any way you can pull out cost from the structure itself, it can be utilized in understanding how much it can contribute value. Obviously, when we're talking about the sales comparison grid, we're talking about, market value and how it's going to appeal to buyers. But if we're really truly looking at the value of that structure, then pulling out a depreciated cost is really beneficial for anyone to do. And I would suggest doing that either way, understanding what it is that you're working with and how you can extract that. I also think, we're looking at extending time, we're looking at extending, distance. But if you find something that is similar to that contributory value, where it may not be a shop, but it may be some other structure on site, that you can try to use that depreciated cost method and pull out some value and understand how these are contributing similar, then you can start to use other structures that are going to be similar.
Yeah, in a perfect world, you'd find a very similar structure, but that's not always possible. And like I said earlier, we can't make this stuff up.
Right.
When we start making this stuff up, we end up with 1982 or whatever, when they were making up land sales in Arkansas just to make values work, and we can't do that as appraisers.
No, we can't.
I could talk about this topic for hours. I think it's an intriguing one. And the thing is, we've talked about rural because that's what I'm comfortable with these days. But if you're in an urban neighborhood, for instance, downtown Nashville or one of the outlying neighborhoods of Nashville, and you've got a historic zoning overlay and an older house that's been fully renovated and they've built an ADU in the backyard, it's the only one, or it's one of three in the neighborhood of, I don't know, 200 homes. It's a similar process. Am I right? You're looking for distance and time and similar utility and functionality and all those things.
It definitely is. And you have to look at how much it is contributing, not just to that home, but also to that neighborhood. So you are looking at, is this the commonality? Are people building ADUs in their backyards? Are they doing them on historic homes? And so that's the analysis that it comes down to. You're not just looking at that specific structure. You're looking at the neighborhood, what your neighbors would choose to do. Would a buyer appreciate that ADU over a home that doesn't? So it definitely is the same process. It's all about analysis. And, it seems so vague to say, but that's really what we do is we pick apart every aspect of every property down to the bare bones so that we can say, yes, that ADU has value, or no, it's really not a contributory item.
So what you're telling me, we've got to look at the neighborhood now. Neighborhood people would respond to that structure. We look at the area and see how people would respond. You're asking me to analyze the market?
Absolutely. I think that's often something that gets lost in translation within appraisal, is that appraisers are truly looking at every aspect of where that property is sitting. They're not just looking at, the lot parameters and the home on that site. They're looking at the neighboring properties. They're looking at any external obsolescence. They're looking at factors that are contributing to sales. So whether or not you have motivated buyers, things like that. So I suggest and encourage our appraiser panel to really look at their market and explain that to the reader.
That's great. And at the end of the day, it's all about communication and explaining what we did, how we did it, and why we did it. Stacy, I'm going to take another quick break and give a shout out to another one of our sponsors, and then we'll come back and wrap this up.
The Appraisal Institute recently launched its Instagram page, AI's latest presence on social media, joining Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and the Face Value podcast. Visit and follow AI's Instagram page for another way to access valuation news and association updates. www.instagram.com/appraisalinstitute.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Hal Humphreys. You're listening to the Appraisal Buzz. I've got Stacy Caprioli from National Appraisal Network with me here today. We're talking about contributory value. Let's talk a little bit, Stacy, about some misconceptions about contributory value, some things that you see sometimes that give you pause.
Yeah, that's a great topic, because I think that when people think of contributory, they think of positive, and that's not always the case. Contributory value can be a negative factor to a site. So, we talked a little bit about the rural, we talked a little bit about ADUs. If someone is developing something and adding something to their site that really truly cannot be supported or is a negative aspect, it can be a negative contributory item. And that's often a misconception. Most people think it's positive. So that would be my primary. I think the other thing that I see the most is that when people are renovating their properties, it's a labor of love. So they are putting in new drywall, new paint, those items where they're spending quite a high budget to make these renovations, but the return on investment for things like paint and, drywall, it's not something that's going to ultimately contribute a large amount of value, and you often don't get that back. So I encourage a lot of people when they're doing renovations to keep that in mind, where, paint and, carpeting and things that are a little bit more neutral may not give you the return on investment than larger contributory items.
I've got one for you. I think this is a good example. I was doing a review for a state agency several years ago, and the complaint that the homeowner filed against the appraiser, the primary problem they had was obviously the value wasn't high enough. And they really harped on the fact that the appraiser did not give any contributory value to the custom koi pond that they had installed. And when I say custom koi pond, I mean Bubba went out with a shovel and got some plastic and lined it with rocks and had a really nice abattoir for fish, like it was a place to kill fish. And the appraiser didn't give it any value. Now, in looking at it, I would have made the argument that it would have had a negative impact.
It could have, yeah. And I think that that's where the analysis of the market comes from, is that are other neighbors having similar features, and are other neighbors going out and doing the same thing to their properties? And if it's a no, then you have to support how then you could extract that adjustment. And would the average buyer go out and want that koi pond, or would they move in and say, oh, we need to fill this in? So you have to look at both aspects of it. I mean, you may find the ideal buyer who is just happens to be looking for a koi pond, but it really depends on the market itself. And I often say, landscaping is one of those things where people spend a great deal to invest into their properties on landscaping, and it's wonderful, but the return on investment and how we adjust in an appraisal, it's just not there for, contributory value. So it's the same with that koi pond. One person may want a koi pond, one person may want a gazebo or a pizza oven. These are items that, people start adding in, and it really becomes a preference. But we have to extract a value as appraisers. We're looking at the whole picture.
Yeah, I love it. So at the end of the day, I think we're going to go back and say this probably 400,000 more times throughout the course of our careers. Explain what you do, why you do it, have support for your conclusions, and tell people what it is you've done. If you do these things, I think by and large, you can avoid revision request, which is a really interesting topic that we have on our show sheet here today. When an appraiser gets a reconsideration of value request, from your perspective as a chief appraiser, what should that appraiser do?
I think that any reconsideration of value needs to be taken seriously, obviously, but we also need to look at why that reconsideration of value is coming in. Was it because a CU score of overvaluation came in? Was there a CU score of undervaluation that came in? Were there specific features that were called out in that ROV? And I encourage all of our lenders and brokers to really do that, to say, this comparable has this feature where the original comparable doesn't. Just applying comps to an appraiser without any justification, we tend to see it, but there has to be some support for that. So I would suggest that any appraiser that feels like, hey, there isn't enough support for why these comps were sent to me, can I get a little bit more clarification, push back. But I also think that, again, commentary, like we said, communication, being able to say to the ROV requester, this is why you selected these sales from my understanding, but this is why I did not. It's really about explaining. And if you do use one of the comps from an ROV, or you do expand your commentary, just doing it in a fashion that makes the reader understand why it was not there in the first place. And that's what I always say is, maybe it wasn't something that you put in the physical report, but was in your work file. Now's the time to come forward and say, well, I had considered this, and this was why I didn't do it, and really taking your work file and almost putting it into your report.
Yeah. And that leads to another thing that I've been preaching from the pulpit of the classroom for the past couple of years. We live in a digital age. Memory is cheap. You can get a hard drive. You can get Dropbox. You can get, Google Drive, any of these places to store information. If you're doing your sales research, capture everything you look at. If you look at it, take a screenshot. If you consider it, have some notes on it. But if you have a robust work file, you can then, when you get the revision or the reconsideration of value request, if you got a robust work file, there's a really good chance you're going to have any sale that a realtor is going to throw at you.
Absolutely.
and be able to address those. And look, I've had reconsideration of value requests come back with absolutely no merit whatsoever, and sales that made absolutely no sense. And I was required to comment on those sales, and that made me angry as an appraiser. It was a waste of my time. It was a waste of everybody's time, and I didn't get paid anymore for it.
Right.
But when I get a reconsideration of value from someone that says, "Hey, here's what I think you missed. Would you look at this, and this?" That gives me some direction. And I think it's useful, Stacy, you tell me if I'm wrong about this, for appraisers not to have an ego in this work. I don't have an ego in it.
No,
If
I
I
agree completely. I think that we're a profession.
Yeah.
We are professionals at the end of the day, and justification of our work is a normal part of every career. So I would suggest that we kind of remove ourselves from that feeling of like, I don't have the time for this, or I've already answered it, because obviously if it was answered, somebody wouldn't be requesting more. So that's where I just say, come away from that and just sit down, make a response, make it strong, and move forward. It's often the best way to do that.
I love it. Stacy, thank you so much for being here. Jim Morrison, you still in the room there, boss?
Yeah, absolutely. Before we go, we do have an anonymous appraiser for you and Stacy. This anonymous appraiser question says, I've always been told an above ground pool is personal property. I appraised a house recently where there was a homeowner had built a deck around their above ground pool that attached to the house. The realtor was telling me I needed to find comps with pools because this deck made it permanent. Who's right here?
Stacy, I'm going to let you take that one.
That's a good one. There's a lot to factor in there. One being that, in my perspective, if you have to disrupt something permanent to remove something that is portable, then it would be considered permanent to me. So that decking is going to be permanent, at least for the nature of that appraisal in my mind, where you could move that above ground pool, but you would have to disturb something that is a permanent structure on your property. So I would suggest, and I know this is perfect world situation, if there is something in the market where shows, let's say, an above ground pool that didn't have decking that happened during a sale, and then maybe an in-ground pool, and be able to extract differing perspectives on that, that's what I would ideally want. If you cannot still, and we're talking about, let's say, in some of these rural markets or areas where pools are not common, like in Wisconsin, if you're talking about that, then expanding your time and distance, and if you still cannot extract an adjustment for an above ground pool with decking, you really almost have to just value the decking.
Yeah, and I despise above ground pools, not because I don't like them, but I despise them for this very, very question. When I'm looking at a house that's got an above ground pool, I almost want to withdraw from the assignment because I don't like dealing with these things. Here's the thing. If you remove the pool, which you almost always can, and you're left with decking, a lot of times it's going to have a little circle and no handrail on that side. I think the decking at that point becomes useless. I think here's the thing. I think at the end of the day, the appraiser has to make the call. And how do you make that call as a real estate appraiser? If you're in an area, I'm in rural West Tennessee, there are a number of above ground pools with amazing decks built around them. In that market, they consider them permanent fixtures. If I can make that argument, I'll do that. If that argument is not there, then don't do that. Call it personal property, move on.
Right. I completely agree. And I think that this is where, as appraisers, this is where we get our slight variances in process. If I pick up a report and I'm out on a property and I see an above ground pool and I do it one way, I may apply a slight adjustment. But you may have another appraiser that comes to site and says, this does not warrant an adjustment. And really, the difference that you have to have there is, there has to be support for both. And, again, it's an opinion of value. So, you can have those slight variances, but I agree with you. I think it's market driven for sure, because here, we see above ground pools, but typically they're not, built up to be a year-round structure. They're not permanently affixed, and that definitely changes the way you look at things.
Yeah, and let's be clear, not all above ground pools are built equally. I've seen some that are, a third of the pool is in the ground. It's built out of a shipping container. It's got a glass wall on one side. It's uber cool and hip.
Yeah.
I've seen, metal poles and plastic, everything in between. So at the end of the day, Jim, I would say to the anonymous appraiser, the answer that everybody hates from our attorney friends, it depends. And it's going to depend on your research and your analysis of the market and how they see that issue. And I'm absolutely certain, Stacy, we're going to get some feedback on this topic from appraisers across the country that say, "Oh, absolutely not, you've got to do this," and no one says, "Oh, absolutely not, you've got to do that." So I'm curious to see how that comes out.
Yeah, me too. And I think that that's the value of our profession, though, is that there's so many differing perspectives based on where you're located. And so I welcome the feedback for items like this, because that's how we're all encouraging each other to have visibility and learn how to adapt to differing areas. And so I welcome the feedback, and I'm interested to see what people say about it.
Yeah, and I've been doing a lot of review work for the past 15 years. And one of the things, and I'm sure you've seen this in your professional experience, when I review other appraisers' work, a lot of times I learn so much from how they've done things that it informs how I appraise property moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I always say to my team is that we're not here to recreate the wheel. So, we're not redoing the appraisal, but at the same point, you have to understand what that appraiser is doing, and you have to look at it from a critical thinking aspect and make sure that everything makes sense. And a lot of times that does make the light bulb go off for some people and say, "Oh, that was great. I really like that commentary." And in those instances, we're sending feedback to the appraiser right away and saying, "This was spot on. You did a great job." And we get that a lot from our lender partners too, where they'll come back and say, "This appraiser did it exactly how we would expect it to be done, just from an analysis perspective, not just from a value perspective, but analysis." And that's great. Encouraging the appraisers to really support their perspective is the goal of our profession.
And at the end of the day, Stacy, I'm so glad to hear you say what you just said. I know appraisal management companies get a bad rap. A lot of appraisers just rage against the machine. I've worked with a number of appraisal management companies over the years, and the ones that I work with are ones that will call me or send me an email saying, "Oh my gosh, you did a really good job with X, Y, or Z." When you take the time to point out something that somebody did right, it goes a long way, because a lot of times we appraisers out here in the field get nothing but, "You're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong." So I'm glad to hear you say that.
Yeah, absolutely. And AMCs, we always talk about, there is this negativity, but our theme here at NAN is that, like, you don't have to like your AMC, but you can like your AMC. And we hope that our appraisers like working for NAN.
I love it. I love it. Stacy, thank you for being here today. Jim, let's get back in here and wrap this thing up. Seriously, Stacy, I can't thank you enough. This has been a fantastic conversation, and it's made me forget about COVID for about 20 minutes, which is lovely.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, thank you for having me. I could talk about these topics forever. I love talking about appraisal and valuation. So thank you for having me. It's been great.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, thank you guys. This was an absolutely wonderful Buzzcast. We appreciate all this conversation. It's going to be teaching tape for a course one day. I think that this has been such a great conversation. Appraisers, let us know in the comments below what you think. We're looking forward to that feedback. And then Hal, I'll let you take us out.
For Jim Morrison and Stacy, I'm Hal Humphreys. You've been listening to the Appraisal Buzzcast. Have a great week.